Sometimes, history has a way of teaching lessons, whether you're ready for the class or not. At Everton Academy, a predominantly white suburban school, hallways buzzed with cliques and quiet conformity. It wasn't that black students didn't exist here. They did, but they were few, their presence often treated like an afterthought rather than a contribution. 16-year-old Zara Johnson, a bright yet reserved student, blended into the background, her dark skin and unassuming demeanor making her an easy target for subtle slights. Mrs. Evelyn Hart, a veteran history teacher known for her sharp tongue, stood at the center of today's lesson. The classroom, at room 214, was plain, adorned only with faded posters of historical figures who all shared one thing in common: their whiteness. Neither Zara nor Mrs. Hart knew it yet, but this day would unravel far beyond textbooks or lectures. The classroom buzzed with the usual morning chatter until Mrs. Hart's sharp voice cut through. "All right, settle down," she said, her gaze lingering on Zara, as if expecting her to be the source of disruption. When no one spoke up, she began writing today's topic on the board: Black History Month. "Zara," Mrs. Hart said abruptly, turning around with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes, "since you're our resident expert, why don't you tell us what makes this month so special?" A few students snickered at the emphasis she placed on special. Zara hesitated but stood up calmly. "It's about celebrating contributions African Americans have made to history." "Contributions?" Mrs. Hart interrupted, raising an eyebrow. "Like what? Jazz music? Sports? It's not exactly rocket science, is it?" A murmur rippled through the class. Zara clenched her fists under the desk, but kept her tone steady. "It's also about leaders like Frederick Douglass, Maya Angelou, and Barack Obama." Mrs. Hart smirked. "Oh yes, because a black president fixed everything, didn't he?" She turned back to the board, dismissing Zara with a wave. "Let's move on to something more relevant." Zara sat down, her cheeks burning. The subtle jabs stung, but she bit her tongue, unwilling to give Mrs. Hart the satisfaction of seeing her crack. For now, the classroom grew quieter as Mrs. Hart's tone sharpened, her words cutting through the air like a knife. "You know, Zara," she said with feigned curiosity, leaning against her desk, "I've always wondered, why do we even need a special month for Black history? Isn't that divisive?" Her lips curled into a smug grin, eyes scanning the room for agreement. Zara clenched her jaw but kept her voice steady. "It's not about division. It's about representation. People who look like me have been erased from history books for centuries." Mrs. Hart let out a short laugh, shaking her head. "Oh, please. Erased? Or maybe there just wasn't much worth writing about back then." A few students chuckled nervously, though some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "Are you serious right now?" Zara shot back, her patience fraying at the edges. "What about slavery? Jim Crow laws? Systemic racism? Those aren't exactly small details." Mrs. Hart raised an eyebrow, her expression dripping with condescension. "Well, isn't it convenient how everything always comes back to race with you people? Maybe if you focus less on victimhood and more on personal responsibility." The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging heavily. Zara felt heat rise to her cheeks, her fists trembling under the desk. She wanted to scream, to call out the hypocrisy, but instead, she forced herself to take a slow breath. "And what does you people even mean?" Another student muttered under their breath, though not loud enough for Mrs. Hart to hear. Mrs. Hart crossed her arms, glaring down at Zara. "If you can't handle constructive criticism, perhaps this conversation is over. Unless," she paused, tilting her head mockingly, "unless you think your opinion deserves special treatment too." Zara swallowed hard, biting back the retort burning in her throat. For now, she stayed seated, but the tension in the room was unbearable. Something had to give. The tension in the classroom reached a boiling point as Mrs. Hart's mocking tone grew sharper, her words cutting deeper with each passing moment. "You know, Zara," she said, leaning forward on her desk with an air of feigned concern, "perhaps you're too sensitive for this kind of discussion. Maybe Black History Month isn't your strong suit, after all." Zara's hands trembled under the table, but she forced herself to meet Mrs. Hart's gaze. It's not about being sensitive. It's about respect, something you clearly don't understand. Mrs. Hart's smile faltered for just a second before snapping back into place, colder than before. Respect? Oh, please. Don't lecture me about respect when you can't even control your attitude. She turned to the rest of the class, raising her voice slightly. Does anyone else think it's ironic that someone so obsessed with equality is acting like they're above everyone else? A few students shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact, while others murmured vague agreements, unwilling to challenge their teacher. Zara felt the weight of their silence pressing down on her, suffocating. Fine, Zara shot back, her voice rising despite her best efforts to stay calm. If you want to talk about attitudes, maybe we should start with yours. You've been belittling me since I walked in here today. Mrs. Hart's face flushed red, whether from anger or embarrassment, it was hard to tell. That's enough, she snapped, slamming her hand against the desk. I will not tolerate insubordination in my classroom. If you can't handle constructive criticism, then perhaps you shouldn't be here at all. Before Zara could respond, Mrs. Hart pointed sharply toward the door. Get out. Now. For a split second, Zara froze, stunned by the sheer audacity of the command. The room fell deathly silent, every pair of eyes glued to her. Her heart pounded her chest, humiliation burning hot across her cheeks. But there was no fighting this, not now. With one last defiant glare at Mrs. Hart, Zara grabbed her bag and stormed out of the classroom, the door slamming shut behind her. As she stood in the empty hallway, fists clenched and tears threatening to spill over, Zara knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Zara sat on the cold, hard bench outside the classroom, her phone trembling in her hands. Tears she had fought so hard to hold back finally spilled over as she dialed her father's number. It rang twice before his deep, reassuring voice answered. Zara? What's wrong? It's at school, she stammered, her voice breaking. Mrs. Hart, she kicked me out of class because I stood up for Black History Month. She was so racist, Dad. I can't stay here. There was a brief pause on the other end, and then his tone shifted, calm but sharp. I'm coming in 20 minutes. Don't say another word to anyone until I get there. True to his word, Marcus Johnson arrived within 20 minutes, his tall frame and commanding presence filling the hallway. He knelt beside Zara, his expression softening as he wiped away her tears. Tell me everything, he said gently, and she did. Through shaky breaths, Zara recounted every dismissive comment, every mocking jab, and the humiliating moment when Mrs. Hart sent her out of the classroom. As he listened, his jaw tightened, anger simmering beneath his composed exterior. When she finished, he placed a firm hand on her shoulder. You did nothing wrong, Zara. Let's fix this together. His voice carried an unshakable resolve, one that promised action. For the first time all day, Zara felt a flicker of hope. Marcus Johnson strode into the classroom, his presence commanding immediate silence. The students turned in their seats, eyes wide with curiosity and unease, while Mrs. Hart froze mid-sentence, her chalk still poised against the board. When she finally turned to face him, her lips parted in recognition. Mrs. Evelyn Hart, Senator Johnson said, his deep voice cutting through the tension like a blade. His tone was calm, but carried an unmistakable edge of authority. I believe we need to have a conversation. Mrs. Hart's face paled as realization dawned. She straightened her posture, attempting to regain some semblance of composure. Senator Johnson, what brings you here? Her attempt at politeness rang hollow, even to herself. I'm here because my daughter was removed from your class today, humiliated, mocked, and dismissed for no reason other than standing up for something meaningful. He stepped closer, his piercing gaze locking onto hers. Care to explain? The room grew so quiet that the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead seemed deafening. Mrs. Hart swallowed hard, glancing nervously at the students before forcing a brittle smile. Zara wasn't removed without cause. She was disruptive during class. Disruptive? Senator Johnson interrupted, his voice rising slightly but remaining controlled. Let me get this straight. My daughter was disruptive because she defended Black History Month? Because she dared to speak about contributions made by people who look like her. He shook his head, disgust evident in every line of his expression. That's not disruption, Mrs. Hart. That's education. Or at least it should be. Mrs. Hart's cheeks flushed red, whether from embarrassment or anger. It was impossible to tell. With all due respect, Senator, I run my classroom how I see fit. If Zara had handled herself more appropriately. More appropriately? He shot back, taking another step forward. You want to talk about appropriateness? Let's start with how you treated her. Do you know what it feels like to sit in a classroom where someone belittles your history, mocks your identity, and then kicks you out when you push back? Is that what you call teaching? Mrs. Hart opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, she glanced around the room, searching for support from her students, but found only blank stares and uncomfortable shifts in their seats. Senator Johnson didn't give her time to recover. You think you're superior because of the color of your skin or the position you hold in this school. Newsflash, Mrs. Hart, you're not. You're just a bully hiding behind a title. And let me make one thing crystal clear. If I ever hear of you treating any student, let alone my daughter, with such blatant disrespect again, there will be consequences far beyond anything you can imagine. For the first time in her career, Mrs. Hart looked genuinely shaken. Her hands trembled as she clutched the edges of her desk, her usual smug confidence crumbling under the weight of his words. I didn't mean to offend anyone, she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. It was never my intention. Intentions don't matter, Senator Johnson cut in sharply. What matters is impact, and the impact of your actions today was harmful. To Zara, to this classroom, to this school. He turned briefly to address the students, his tone softening but still firm. History isn't just dates and names on a page. It's about understanding the struggles and triumphs of those who came before us. All of them, not just the ones who look like you or me. If we can't teach that, then we've failed as educators. The tension in the classroom was palpable as Senator Marcus Johnson stood with Zara by his side, his commanding presence still radiating authority. Mrs. Hart sat frozen at her desk, her face pale and hands trembling. The students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of what would happen next. Just as Senator Johnson opened his mouth to speak further, the door creaked open, and Principal Richard Grayson entered, his tie slightly askew and sweat beading on his forehead. Senator Johnson, Principal Grayson said breathlessly, clearly having rushed to the scene. His eyes darted between the senator, Mrs. Hart, and the silent sea of students. I heard there was an incident here today. May I speak with you privately? Senator Johnson's gaze hardened. Anything you have to say can be said right here, in front of everyone. Transparency is important, isn't it? He gestured toward the room, his tone leaving no room for argument. Principal Grayson swallowed visibly but nodded, stepping into the center of the classroom. His voice wavered as he addressed the group. Mrs. Hart, I've been informed about your conduct during this class session. He paused, glancing nervously at the senator before continuing. And frankly, it's unacceptable. Mrs. Hart shot up from her chair, her usual composure shattered. Unacceptable? You're going to take their word over mine? I've taught here for 20 years without a single complaint. Without a single complaint. Senator Johnson interjected sharply, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. Or without anyone brave enough to report you until now. Because trust me, if we dig deeper, we'll find plenty more stories like Zara's. Principal Grayson winced at the implication, his mind racing. He knew all too well that the school district couldn't afford a scandal, not with budget cuts looming and parents already questioning the administration's competence. And certainly not with someone as influential as Senator Johnson involved. Mrs. Hart, the principal began again, his tone firmer now, though tinged with regret. Your behavior today crossed every line imaginable. Mocking a student for celebrating Black History Month? Kicking her out of class for standing up for herself? That's not just unprofessional, it's discriminatory. It's grounds for immediate termination. What? Mrs. Hart shrieked, her face turning crimson. You can't fire me. This is ridiculous. She started it. She was disruptive, disrespectful. Disrespectful. Senator Johnson interrupted, his voice rising with controlled fury. My daughter was respectful when she explained the significance of Black History Month. She was respectful when you mocked her contributions. And she was respectful even when you kicked her out of your classroom. But you were none of those things. You belittled her, dismissed her identity, and humiliated her in front of her peers. If anyone deserves to lose their job today, it's you. Mrs. Hart turned pleading eyes to Principal Grayson. Richard, please. We've worked together for years. Don't let one angry parent ruin everything. Principal Grayson hesitated, guilt flickering across his face. But then he glanced at Senator Johnson, whose expression remained steely and unyielding. He thought about the headlines that would surely follow if this situation escalated further. Local school faces backlash over racist teacher incident. No, he couldn't risk it. Not with his career and the school's reputation on the line. I'm sorry, Evelyn. Principal Grayson said finally, his shoulders sagging under the weight of the decision. But Senator Johnson is right. What happened here today isn't just a breach of policy. It's a violation of basic human decency. Effective immediately, you're terminated. The room fell deathly silent. Mrs. Hart staggered backward, clutching the edge of her desk for support. Her lips moved soundlessly, as if trying to form words that wouldn't come. Tears welled up in her eyes, but they weren't enough to sway the verdict. You can't do this, she whispered hoarsely, shaking her head. You can't. Oh, we absolutely can, Senator Johnson replied coldly. And if you try to fight this, rest assured, I'll make sure the entire community knows exactly why you lost your job. Mrs. Hart collapsed into her chair, defeated. For the first time, she looked small, diminished. The arrogance and superiority she had worn like armor were stripped away, leaving only shame and fear. Principal Grayson cleared his throat, addressing the stunned students. Class, I want to apologize on behalf of this institution for what you witnessed today. Racism has no place in our school, or anywhere else. Moving forward, we will implement mandatory diversity training for all staff members, and we'll ensure that incidents like this never happen again. Senator Johnson stepped forward, his tone softening slightly as he addressed the students directly. History isn't just something you read about in books. It's alive in each of us, in our identities, our struggles, and our triumphs. Celebrating Black History Month isn't optional, it's essential. Understanding and respecting each other's stories is how we build a better future. As he spoke, Zara felt a surge of pride swelling in her chest. Her father wasn't just defending her. He was standing up for something bigger, something meaningful. When the speech ended, Principal Grayson escorted Mrs. Hart out of the classroom, her sobs echoing down the hallway. The remaining silence was heavy but charged with possibility, a chance for change, for growth. Zara looked up at her father, who placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You handled yourself with grace and courage today, he said softly. I'm proud of you. For the first time in hours, Zara smiled. By the next morning, the incident had gone viral. Videos of Senator Marcus Johnson's confrontation with Mrs. Hart spread across social media, sparking outrage and admiration in equal measure. Hashtags like hashtag Justice for Zara and hashtag Respect in Schools trended nationwide, amplifying calls for systemic change. The school board, under intense public scrutiny, acted swiftly to address the fallout. In a press conference, Superintendent Linda Meyer announced sweeping reforms: mandatory anti-racism training for all staff, updated curricula to include diverse perspectives, and an anonymous reporting system for students to flag discrimination. This moment is a wake-up call, she stated firmly. We must do better for Zara, for every student, and for our community. At Everton Academy, the atmosphere began to shift. Students felt empowered to speak up. Teachers approached their roles with renewed sensitivity, and posters celebrating Black History Month were displayed prominently throughout the halls. For Zara, walking through those same corridors now filled her not with dread but pride, proof that one voice could spark meaningful change. Have you ever experienced a moment where someone tried to silence your voice? Share your experience in the comments. If you enjoyed this and want more content on inspiring Black Stories channel like this, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Thanks for watching, and remember, Black history is American history, and it continues to be made every single day.